IVM.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Atish, Padhy, Communications Manager at Takshashila Institution. And with me today is Aarushi Kataria, who is a junior research scholar at Takshashila. Today, we are going to be talking about the role of social movements in influencing public policy. Now, across the world, representative democracies are overwhelming majority. At the same time, it is often the case that the representatives we elect to power might not always act in our best interests, because after all, they are humans with their own vested interests as well. So in situations like this, social movements become extremely important as a way in which the public can get involved in the influencing of public policy. And we have seen over the last few years many such examples of how the involvement of people en masse can help legislate or overturn a controversial policy. In France, the Yellow Vest movement managed to do this with the tax policy in the country. In India last year, we saw how the farmer protests were able to influence the repealing of the farm bills. But today we will be talking about the importance of social movements in public policy through a case study from Pakistan, where an organization of working women was able to help implement a law against sexual harassment in workplaces in Pakistan. Before we get started, listener, do remember that the admissions for our public policy courses are open. The last date to apply for the May cohort of our public policy courses is on 30th April, that is Saturday. So hurry up, and I'm sure you'll find our offerings very interesting. So Aarushi, hello and welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm well. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, which is about the role of this organization called ASHA in drafting and implementing the law against sexual harassment in Pakistan, can you talk briefly a little bit more about why social movements are important as a way of influencing policies, and especially do they become more relevant in semi-democratic or authoritarian regimes like Pakistan, because Pakistan has never completely been a proper democracy, even if they have some sort of representation.
Right. So I think to begin with, to understand what exactly do we mean by a social movement, so I'll go back to Taro and Tilly's definition of a social movement, which says that a social movement is a sustained challenge to power holders in the name of the population living under the jurisdiction of those power holders by public means of display of that population's unity, numbers, and commitment. Now, to answer your question about why, or is it really related to democracy or semi democracies, and for that matter, I do think there is a broad correlation between democracy and social movements. And this is because of a simple fact that the same processes that promote democratization are also promoting social movement. This includes, increases in the numbers and connections among potential political participants. This could be because of urbanization, grouping of people coming under the umbrella of a large social movement organization. It could be because of equalization of resources and connections amongst the people who are participating. This could be through public education happening because of a movement. It could be because of access to media. It could be because of greater representation or electoral processes. And it could also be insulation of public politics from existing social inequalities, for example, through the formation of cross-class political coalition and parties. And lastly, it could also be because of the integration of interpersonal solidarities into public politics. This could be, because of sharing of benefits between the public and the private. Now, These promoters of democracy also facilitate social movements because they break down clientelistic relationships. They also become a way of favoring wide ranging connections amongst dispersed people in a country. And they become a way for breaking down any segmentation that was there in the society because now people are coming together to talk about one particular issue. So I do think that while we may tend to associate social movements with democracy, since these tend to allow people to come together in large numbers in a public space and raise contentions against those in power, it also becomes equally important in semi democracies or semi authoritarian states where the people are tired of living under the repression of the establishment. And there is an opening where they can make their voice heard. So I think there is a broad correlation between democracy and social movements, but as long as the broader social political context of the country allows for a social movement to arise and there is an organization willing to take that leap and get large numbers of people to participate, we might just find a very large number of social movements occurring within semi democracy or semi authoritarian states as well.
All right. Thank you very much. That was a very coherent and concise answer. So, within that context, let us visit Pakistan. First of all, tell us why Pakistan as a case is interesting and a little bit about the organization, ASHA, and give us a little bit of the history.
Right. So I think the first thing to understand is that Pakistan had a very vague definition of what sexual harassment stood for. And it was through the work and sustained work of ASHA, which is the Alliance Against Sexual Harassment, that the definition for sexual harassment was concretized. What makes it interesting or what makes ASHA really important is that they were able to get two pieces of anti-sexual harassment legislation passed in early 2010. The first was an amendment to Section 509 of the Pakistan Penal Code, which was basically replacing a very vague directive that which said that to punish anyone who insults the modesty of a woman with a far more comprehensive definition of sexual harassment. It also widened the legislative scope to include both the public and the private spheres, which meant that the penalty that was associated with sexual harassment also increased. And the second one was the creation of a whole act itself, which was called the Protection Against Harassment of Women at the Workplace. This act covered the workplace comprehensively and included a clause that made it mandatory for all organizations to develop self-regulatory mechanisms for dealing with instances of sexual harassment that, complied with what was laid down in the act itself. And any institution that failed to do so could be fined in court. And this becomes important because this means that institutional mechanisms have to be set up within the private organizations and they're going to be followed by, or rather complemented by, institutions within the public sphere through courts as well. Now, what is ASHA? ASHA is known as, again, as I said, against Alliance Against Sexual Harassment. It's a group comprising of like-minded individuals who are affiliated with different organizations, but who believe that time had come in Pakistan to change the sexual harassment law. They worked over 10 long years to get this bill passed. It wasn't an easy way for them to do it. It is completely volunteer based and non hierarchical. It took them 10 years for this vision to become a reality because one has to understand that simply because there is an opening in the socio-political context to start a conversation doesn't mean that the wider socio-political context is also ready for that change. That's exactly why it took them 10 years. ASHA worked on educating people. It worked with legislators to try and get them on board with understanding why a change in the sexual harassment law was important. It had to get a lot of political clout on board because this was being done through institutional mechanisms, which is also a very interesting selection of the repertoire itself as to why did ASHA choose to go through an institutional mechanism rather than maybe doing a demonstration of force through numbers by protesting on the streets. And also the way they worked, they did not try and be very clinical with numbers. They used something called emotional work. And I think that's what makes ASHA a very interesting case study, that they didn't go the regular route of what we've come to associate with social movements. Today, we think of social movements and it's almost ubiquitous with a protest on the streets, a mass demonstration. But in something that doesn't last more than a few months, but ASHA sustained over 10 years and it used completely institutional mechanisms to do so. So I think that's what makes ASHA's case study very interesting for us to read and understand about.
Those are very interesting points. And once again, an excellent summary of ASHA. Now, one of the things that stood out for me about ASHA was the fact that firstly, it was started by some of the founding members were part of UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and they had filed sexual harassment suits against some of their bosses at the UNDP office in Islamabad. Right. So, and after facing trouble getting justice, they wanted to extend it to all of Pakistan so that women in similar situations will also be able to get justice. And for that reason, I was wondering if the role of class here becomes important because the founders in this case were more privileged than the average Pakistani woman, right? And you also said how we associate social movements mostly with mass demonstrations and protests. And I was wondering if that is also because those movements are often by less privileged parts of a society who do not have access to those institutions means as easily as the more privileged ones. So can you throw some more light on that about the importance of class and privilege in this whole movement?
Yeah, I completely agree with you that class is a very important consideration. Class interests, that is, based on where you stand in the social hierarchy, become very important when it comes to the choice of repertoire. And this goes back to, again, a theory by Charles Tiddy, one of the most major writers when it came to social movements, who said that the choice of repertoires is directly based on the accumulated history that a group has. It is based on the experiences that a group has. And now, if you come from a place of privilege, you are someone who comes with a lot of social capital and network. It's a lot easier for you to go through institutional mechanisms because you know that the system is going to serve you. Yet, if you come from a marginalized group, getting heard, like getting the system to serve you is almost like a far dream, and getting them to hear you is your basic goal at the starting point. So I do think class plays a very important role. For instance, to sort of move away from the Pakistan case study for a movement, when we think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, which said, "We are the 99%." That was the slogan of the Occupy Wall Street movement. What it was saying is that they were all equal, that the 99% that were protesting against the 1% who had all the wealth were all equal, and there was no difference between them. But don't you think that that is sort of contradictory? Because we know that there are gross inequalities that exist, that even if you look at India, when you think about the middle class, you aren't really at the middle of the income distribution. You're at the upper, higher deciles of the income distribution. And it's also important to understand that at times when you have movements that go through institutional routes, it's only those who are educated and they find it easier to participate. These are people who have spent years or probably generations building the social capital that they have right now. It could also be that this emphasis on using an institutional route is to say that we don't want to dismantle the institutions because they're serving us. So I think at some point, while the women acknowledge that they don't have the privilege that men do because of patriarchy, there is a certain class privilege that they bring with them because these institutions have in large served them. And that is why they don't want to dismantle the institution altogether, but rather just bring about some incremental change within it. So I do think that their class played a very important role in them selecting the institutional mechanism and probably not going out in the streets. But to maybe give them the benefit of doubt, it could be that Pakistan is a semi authoritarian state, that if they had gone out in the street, they would have been met with repression. And as you mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, was that at the point when between 2001 and 2010, the Pakistan legislature had a lot more women than it has had historically. So maybe going through the institutional route was also keeping that fact in mind, that there are people within the legislature who understand their plight, where they don't have to expend as much energy as they would have had to maybe at a previous point in time, because at least for whatever part of the legislature is coming from women, they understand that sexual harassment is a problem, and the amount of energy that they would have to expend on convincing people is lowered. So I think one way to think about it is class, but another way, if you were to maybe go the rational choice route, could also be that they weighed the pros and cons and they felt that the pros outweighed the cons when it came to using the institutional route rather than going out protesting on the street, which could have attracted far more global attention than through the institutional route could have.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. I mean, after all, that they have a privilege is an undeniable fact that they can't do anything about it. So using their privilege for the better is a very rational and wise decision, right? For us. So the fact that they managed to use their privilege and political connections and the position in Pakistani society to be able to implement a change that they thought was necessary is as good a use of privilege as you can get. So I mean, there was no intention to privilege shame anyone in my question. And yeah, you mentioned about an historic contingency, a very interesting historical fact that was there in Pakistan at that time, which is a representation of women in Pakistan's national legislature was higher than it historically has been, or it has been since. After 2011, 12, it has fallen drastically. And before 2002 and 3, 2, 3, it was still quite low. So, do you want to go a little bit more into that? Because you also spoke about something that they did, which was emotional work, how they tapped into emotions of Pakistani society in order to attract attention to this and make this an important thing. And now, how does having more female legislators in the legislature help them achieve that?
So I think one way to understand is that everyone has finite energy within them. And in case initially they had to convince maybe 90% of the Senate that, sexual harassment is a real problem, that would require a considerable amount of energy. But say now that the proportion of women in the parliament has risen, they probably have to convince about 70% of the Senate that, listen, sexual harassment is a real problem. And I think it's very interesting that as women, they go and use emotions because emotions are generally seen as something irrational. You wouldn't think that they could be a very rational repertoire that is chosen by somebody to affect real change. When we think of emotions, we generally think of reflexive emotions like anger, surprise, but we don't understand that that they go a lot deeper than that. Now, emotions are a way for us to perceive the world. Our thinking and feeling processes go hand in hand. Now, and this is to say that feeling and thinking are parallel. We don't distinguish between them at all. And while some emotions are reflexive, that is the anger you feel, maybe that something isn't being done, there are far more long term emotions like what is moral, what is effective, like the loyalty that the members of ASHA themselves have had to the movement for over 10 years. Those are long term emotions that are being felt by people. Now, it's important that as women that they put in the emotional work, which is what author Sadaf Ahmad refers to, wherein what they did was they played on this idea of feeling rules or emotion rules as to how women are supposed to be those who feel more, or rather they try to incite the fact that women are feeling this kind of way. And it was quite interesting that despite being a movement that wanted to empower women, they very implicitly played on this idea of invoking the emotion of protectiveness in the male senator. They realized that going the extremely rational and clinical route of giving these senators numbers about sexual harassment that had been rising in Pakistani companies and organizations would do nothing, or giving them the number of open cases in the courts would do nothing. But if you went and you were a far more personal when you said that, what if this was your sister? What if this was your mother? Which is a very common dialogue that we hear today. Like, what if she was someone you knew? What if she was related to you? Wouldn't you feel the kind of anger that you aren't feeling right now? They try to do exactly what has been sort of implicitly done over the years, that men have to protect women. And I think that's also implicit in the way the act was named. It is the protection of women against harassment in the workplace. So I think it was interesting that without explicitly stating that we're invoking that feeling, they wanted to sort of give them the same feeling that would push them into action, even though that feeling of arising or inciting protectiveness is regressive to society by saying that women need to be protected. But they knew that would get the task done. So I think it's quite interesting that women of ASHA used emotions, which are seen as completely irrational things, to get something done. And they use that in a way where they completely gamified the situation, where they got the male senators to see this as a way of protecting them rather than this being something about women asking for equal rights. So I think that was quite interesting.
That's an excellent point. And in fact, there's a lot of psychological research suggesting that this cognition emotion binary that we draw, which tells us that emotion is something that is not desirable or completely irrational, is a little dubious. So yeah, that's a very smart move, it seems to me, because one of the important hurdles often in convincing people that a social movement is worth it is that convincing them that a problem exists, right? And if there are a significant amount of women in the parliament or in the legislature, then that task become a little easier. And then for the various other male stakeholders who might have problems with this law for various reasons, especially in a conservative country like Pakistan, then you can adopt all of these other more regressive, within quotes, tactics that can help you get there, because you can play on different emotions. You can play on the patriarchal emotions of a conservative old patriarchal senator, or you can play on the matriarchal emotions of a conservative orthodox matriarchal senator. So yeah, those were some very interesting points. But just to backtrack a little bit, before they got directly involved with the Pakistani parliament and helped bring this law to life, they also worked with private organizations. Before they thought the country was ready as a whole to adopt this, they went to various private organizations and convinced them that this is an important thing to do. Anti-sexual harassment code should be there in all workplaces, is what they try to convince various private organizations. Now, this seems a very smart move as well, but I have two questions. One is, of course, like, what are the benefits of this? And secondly, do you think one of the biggest drawbacks of this would be enforceability? Because in their own, like the founders of the ASHA organization themselves face this, because UNDP had its own code of anti-sexual harassment, but they had to go to New York to the headquarters in order to get the whole thing resolved. And it did not happen within the Islamabad office. So that lack of enforceability, would that not be a very big hurdle that might have actually not helped the movement get as far as it did? How did they overcome that? Like, because private organizations have incentives not to act if someone from higher management is involved in a sexual harassment case without the coercive power of the state involved.
Right. So I completely agree with you. But then I'm also immediately reminded of, again, to sort of digress a little about, marriage equality in the US for same sex couples, where initially the US government was giving over 1,100 tax benefits to married couples, but but marriage itself was an institution meant for two people from of a man and a woman. It wasn't meant for same sex couples at all. And it took years of legislative fighting for this to actually become enforceable at the national level, where initially only some states were doing it, where there was marriage equality, but it wasn't in other states. And it was noticed even within the United States that for a very developed country, that private organizations had come up with policies that would allow for marriage equality before the state did. And I think one way to think about it is that when the private players start doing something, it might just force the government into action. Because if the government is not moving into action, despite the fact that you are a sort of a representative democracy where you're getting elected by the people, if you aren't acting for the policies that the people really want, the legitimacy of the government itself comes into question. Secondly, the industry works very closely with the government in almost any state. So, in case the private players are doing something and the government is not, it again questions the legitimacy and might make the government come across as regressive. So, I think the pressure could go both ways, that when a law is enacted, it obviously pushes, because of it being, enforceable by law, it pushes private organizations. But I think there's also a bidirectional channel wherein when private organizations start acting, it also puts pressure on the government to act. So I think what you said, your question, the first question with that is, what are the benefits of such a thing? I think the first benefit is that a private organization generally is motivated by markets, which means that it might want to resolve these things faster. It might not take as much time as the courts to resolve a matter, which is something we see even in India, where a court case can run on for years, but generally, private organizations have within their own mandates to finish a sexual harassment investigation within approximately 90 days. Secondly, it could be a way wherein if the state is known to completely, favor only particular groups, an organization cannot outrightly do so, which means that they're probably more likely to listen to those from marginalized groups that probably aren't even recognized by the state as equal citizens and give them a voice, get their concerns heard. But I think, as you mentioned, this is obviously prone to the fact that power dynamics come into play whenever there is going to be hierarchy, which is generally the case when it comes to sexual harassment suits, that there is hierarchy and power dynamic involved. Such private organizational institutions might fail because there is no incentive for them. Protecting the profitable or economic interests of the company will come above, say, protecting maybe the private and moral interests of the employees. So I think that's where it fails. So I do think that while private organizations themselves could influence the government, unless a law is enacted that clearly lays down at least the bare minimum that a company needs to do in order to protect its employees and provide them with the safety that they deserve because they work in a formal workplace. I think there would be wide disparity between what each individual company is doing, and that itself could lead to employees or higher ups exploiting the loopholes in the system and could lead to a further increase in sexual harassment itself. So I think that is where the government comes in to sort of create a uniform playing field wherein at least the bare minimum has to be followed by everyone. And then if you are someone who's a lot more concerned about your employees, you will have more robust mechanisms in place. But the government sort of ensures that there is bare minimum safety being provided to everyone in a formal workplace.
Yeah, that's a fair point. And which is why I was wondering why, like, if there would be a lot of disparity and in some cases it would be enforced, in some organizations it would not be enforced, depending on who the person is, who the accuser is, who the accused is, and government adds a bit having the government involved adds a bit more uniformity to the vote. That's a fair point. Now, finally, to like before we close this, I was just thinking about how the role of emotions in this movement and this entire movement itself has been different from how in India after the horrific rape case in Delhi in 2012 made national headlines and drew a lot of outrage, and then laws were made. And there were many chants of implementing, many calls for implementing death penalty for heinous rapes as a punishment, right? And I was wondering how the role of emotions in both these cases is different, in the sense that what happened in India was in response to a single event that drew a lot of moral shock and outrage. Because I'm sure when we're talking about emotions, shock and outrage would be the most powerful ones because they're such strong emotions and they involve so many people at once. But at the same time, with the ASHA case, it seems that the emotions were strategically manipulated and used by the organization. And in a way, the emotions did not control them, that they could control what emotions to play with which kind of audience at what time so that the law got implemented. But in India, because it was not a institutional driven thing, or like there wasn't an organization or many organizations involved at once at that moment trying to do something like that, it just became a mass moral outrage and then get a lot of arguments for death penalty, even though we know empirically that having implementing death penalty against heinous crimes does not really does not really decrease the number of crimes, and especially in rapes, it might actually increase the likelihood of the victim being murdered afterwards, because anyway, the perpetrator is gonna get hanged, right? So yeah, I don't know if my question is very coherent, but I hope you get my drift about how the role of emotions are different in this. And because we're talking about emotions, I thought this is something that we should touch on because, especially with cases of rape in conservative countries like India and Pakistan, it often becomes issues of grave mass outrage, honor or not.
Right. So I think, again, to just sort of maybe if our listeners don't know exactly what we're meaning by a moral shock would be the contrast between the moral belief that we hold and a real event observation that doesn't sit right with this belief. And a moral shock can very crucially help recruit people, radicalize a movement by enforcing the support for some members. And it also helps the movement provide some level of satisfaction to its individual members by saying that what we're fighting for is really justified. So I think one way to understand what happened in India versus what happened in Pakistan with ASHA is that in India there was no central organization that came out to lead the protests after the heinous rape that happened in New Delhi. It became a decentralized leaderless movement asking for an institutional change. Yet all of these demands were happening outside of these institutions. They were happening out in the public. You got global media to come notice you because of the mass protests that were happening. You had so many people out on the streets protesting for real change that was due for a very, very long time in India. How right or wrong were these demands is again something different. But the fact that we were able to get so many people to understand that this is a real issue that needs to be combated and that regressive laws will not work anymore was something that must be remembered. Now, I think the difference that happened in Pakistan was that the moral shock that was felt in India was simply because it was portrayed by the by national media so much that it was able to create this collective identity around the fact that there is outrage against the event that has occurred and we need to do something about it. Whereas in Pakistan, the outrage, there was a moral shock, but it was far more personal. Wherein, if you look at Fawzia Saeed, who is a member of the national committee, said that, all of the members of ASHA probably had individual experiences of sexual harassment, not once, but multiple times during the course of their involvement in the workplace. And those moral shocks, sort of the repetitive experiences of sexual harassment, sort of compounded to them being able to create an organization and then sustain it for over 10 years to get real change. And I think that's where the difference is. Whereas in India, the moral shock was not personal, so to speak, it became a way to create a collective identity. In Pakistan, it was responsible for actually creating an organization that went and spearheaded the entire movement in Pakistan. So I think when we think about emotions in India, one could say we were being led by reflexive emotions like anger and this idea that a moral code had been completely violated. Whereas in Pakistan, the women realized that acting reflexively might not be the best mechanism because women are generally written off as being too emotional, being too volatile or erratic. And they knew that a way to get themselves heard would be to maybe think of a better way to go about it where they're institutionally they could be heard. So I think even in the article that I was reading about the use of emotions during the ASHA movement, there is this idea that the anger they felt was righteous, that it was not reflexive, but it was because of repeated experiences that this anger was present, that it wasn't something that they felt because something happened to them today, but something that had built over time. So I think that's where the difference comes in. Whereas that, to sort of summarize and conclude this long monologue, in India, it built a decentralized movement with a collective identity that was started because of a moral shock. And that's what led to maybe the idea of mass protest. Whereas in Pakistan, it evolved into a far more institutional mechanism because the moral shocks were felt on a far more personal level by these women through their workplace. And it compounded over time. And because of the fact that it was happening to them in the workplace where you're subjected to these very implicit, distinctions between how a woman feels versus how a man feels and who is allowed to feel what. They knew that if they really wanted to create institutional change, using reflexive emotions would not work. And they knew that maybe at that point where they went to the UNDP, that the Pakistani society was not ready for such a change. They knew that they would have to they had to take 10 years to get this change instituted. They knew that they had to very strategically use emotions in a very different way than a country like India. And one must not forget that India is democratic. When a protest or a demonstration happens, repression by the state will be televised. It will be visible to the world. And a democracy cannot generally afford that. Whereas Pakistan is not democracy, so to speak. So it would be far more easier for them to repress people if such a collective identity and such mobilization based on reflexive emotions had started.
All right, that was very comprehensive. I'm just speculating here about the importance of that really shocking event in bringing moral shock, right? Because earlier in the conversation, we talked about how one of the important hurdles is getting people convinced that this is a problem, right? So you would think that whenever something really horrific and really like infamous happens that draws national attention, like what happened in Delhi in 2012 in India, that would have helped clear that hurdle. But at the same time, as you said, because it's no longer a private thing and because it certainly involves everyone, the work that is needed to actually build bridges, actually try and convince people that something is important and build those connections and work with various stakeholders in order to get it passed. That might not have done, and it just suddenly becomes hijacked by this emotion of moral shock. And then everything that follows is reflexive. So even though one would think that a very infamous event which catches national attention might be helpful, it might actually backfire and not be as helpful. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you that it's very important to understand the context in which a movement must evolve in. And that is why the moral shock itself, the way the moral shock sort of plays out, whether it becomes a more public moral shock versus a more personal moral shock, can be the difference between, say, using far more less visible to the world methods like an institutional method versus using that anger to create mass demonstrations. Now, the moral shock, now just sort of coming back to the Pakistan case, the moral shock also occurred in Pakistan after the movement had begun, years after the movement had begun, just before the bill was going to be voted on in the Senate. All of the senators started sort of dissing the bill, saying that, it's not needed. And this was after ASHA has worked for years and years to try and convince everybody in the Senate, the legislators, that it was very important to have a sexual harassment bill in place, that anti-sexual harassment bill in place. And it was this anger. Now, at this moment, again, the members of ASHA felt reflexive anger because they have spent years of their life working on something and now all of that work is being questioned. But again, we see with the ASHA movement, there is a very strategic move. They felt that if individual legislators are not listening, the next best thing is to go higher up. And that's exactly what they did. One of the founding members of ASHA was Misbah, who channeled her anger to contact the Prime Minister of Pakistan at that point and his wife, and they got them to support the bill publicly. Now, when your head of state is supporting something publicly, it sort of behooves the lower legislators to do the same thing. And I think that was also quite interesting that it's pointed out that the author channeled her anger into something productive, whereas generally you would think that anger would lead to, something far more reflexive, like someone yelling or someone just maybe leaving the room in exasperation. But ASHA was able to, again, use this emotion very strategically to get the Prime Minister to support the bill publicly. And it was only after this that the bill was passed in the Senate. So I think it's very important to understand the context and the inflection points on which the emotions are based and how they're being used by the people, and how the social movements that arise, whether they happen in the public or the private sphere, are so crucial to affecting real public policy change, whether it was something as monumental as maybe the prevention of sexual harassment in Pakistan, or, as you mentioned at the start, the repealing of the farm laws in India. It's very important to understand the emotional work that goes into these movements and how social movements are becoming a very real way to affect legislative change.
No, that's excellent. And I think with that, we can conclude our conversation. That was very enlightening. Aarushi, thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation, listener. We will meet you next time.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is at IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle at Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, the real-life Suryavanshi Vishwas Nagare Patil joined CP Law & Order, talks to Cyrus about his new book, Head Held High. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam talks to Anusha Ramakrishna and Anisha Dosa, co-founders at Jiffy. They discuss the concept of earned wage access and its benefits. Hans Vani completes 100 episodes. Listen to this inspiring story of a boy's struggle called Shambuk, Platform or Pilla. On The Habit Coach, Ashton shares tips of how we can make our lives 10 times better. And on All Things Policy, the Takshashila folk analyze China's recently announced National Computing Network. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. Also, please don't forget to rate us on any of the platforms you're listening to us on. And remember, you can always check us out on YouTube. We have a number of channels. You can go to ivmpodcast.com/YouTube to take a look at what those channels are. We're also doing a small listener survey to understand how you respond to our shows and the advertising on the network. We would really appreciate it if you could spare a few minutes to fill it out. It really helps us build better shows for you and understand what you're looking for from advertising and what we can talk to advertisers about who you are. Please go to ivmpodcast.com/survey. It really would help us out. Thank you so much. And finally, would like to thank our sponsors for the network this week, SBI Life Insurance, India Water Portal, and Jupiter, a digital banking app. Thank you so much for making this possible.
We know you love fast food,
fast fashion,
faster payment,
lightning fast internet speed.
then why not fast information?
On Think Fast, where we discuss the latest developments in the world of technology, business, marketing, pop culture.
With a side of sarcasm and my dad jokes, not just mine.
Not mine, Varun. My jokes are funny. So join me, guys, the funnier one, Suchita Salvan, co-founder of LBB.
And me, Varun Dugirala, the co-founder of The Glitch, as we think fast only on the IVM network.
Fresh episodes out every Wednesday.
On the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.